Hello everyone, welcome to my next lesser known but awesome heroes video, and today I'm going to be taking a look at one of the better non-superpowered female heroines of the Marvel Universe. I'm going to be talking about Mrs. Barbara Morse, aka Mockingbird, the wife of Hawkeye. Now, she's always been a highly important character when it comes to the Avengers, and especially when it comes to Clint Barton, aka Hawkeye. So I felt the need to sort of make a video centered completely around her. So yeah, Barbara Bobby Morse, as she's lovingly called, was actually a student at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She specialized in biochemistry. Eventually, when she graduated college, she became a SHIELD agent under the direction of a Dr. Wilma Calvin. And most of the early comics with her basically involve her teaming up with Ka-Zar, aka Lord Kevin Plunder, and they basically involve her traveling all the way throughout the Savage Land, and she has a few run-ins with she also has a few run-ins with Man-Thing, as well as Ka-Zar. But in my opinion, she didn't actually become real interesting until she actually met Clint Barton, who was actually serving as the chief of security for Cross Technological Enterprises. When they first met, they were actually kidnapped by a supervillain named Crossfire, who wanted to use hypnotic ultrasounds to force all the superheroes to murder each other. So, Hawkeye and Mockingbird basically teamed up to defeat Crossfire, but ever since this battle, Clint Barton always had somewhat of a hearing problem. But after this, Clint and Barbara actually became a couple, and they became one of the more prominent couples of the Marvel Universe. So much so that when Hawkeye actually split from the Avengers to develop the West Coast Avengers, he actually recruited, the first person he recruited was in fact Mockingbird, along with Iron Man, Wonder Man, and Tigra, that is. One of the more interesting adventures that Bobby had with the West Coast Avengers is that basically they tried to stop Kang, who had scattered the entire team across several different time periods. And long story short, Mockingbird and a few members of the West Coast Avengers end up in the Old West, and they end up teaming with a group of Old Western vigilantes to stop a villain named Iron Mask. But unfortunately, Bobby is kidnapped by the Phantom Rider, Lincoln Slade. And Slade gives Bobby a love potion to fall in love with him. And during this whole course, while Bobby is drugged, Lincoln Slade actually rapes her, performs sexual intercourse with her. However, she doesn't actually get pregnant. And when she actually overcomes the love potion's influence and she realizes what Slade did to him, she became completely infuriated, and she went off to face the Phantom Rider one-on-one on a cliff without any of the consent of the other Avengers members. She fought Slade on the roof of a cliff. She ends up beating Slade in a fight, but Slade ends up hanging off the side of the cliff, and she just basically lets him fall. Now, when she and the rest of the West Coast Avengers return back to the modern time, Hawkeye actually learns about this, and she decides to sort of cut Bobby off from the West Coast Avengers, seeing as how she pretty much broke the most important code of not killing anybody. Which character you actually side with in this little moral dilemma, whether it be Mockingbird or Hawkeye, is completely up to you. Probably arguably one of the biggest character arcs that Bobby actually goes through is when she gets cut off from the West Coast Avengers, she's actually haunted by the spirit of Lincoln Slade. Now, what happens here is that Lincoln's great-great-great-great-grandson, Hamilton Slade, discovers his remains, and he takes the costume of the Phantom Rider, and he becomes the new Phantom Rider, while he's completely oblivious to the fact that Lincoln Slade's ghost is actually possessing Hamilton. Of course, Mockingbird, who is completely filled with vengeance for what Lincoln Slade had done to her, tracked down Hamilton Slade to kill him as well. Fortunately, though, Moon Knight shows up and restrains her and actually talks some sense into her. This is when Bobby actually realizes that Hamilton is a victim and that he's being possessed by the ghost of the evil Phantom Rider, Lincoln. So what she does is that she gathers a couple of supernatural heroes to exorcise the spirit of Lincoln Slade out of Hamilton Slade. However, instead of one ghost rising out of Hamilton's body, it's actually two, that of Lincoln and that of his grandfather, Carter Slade, the original Phantom Rider. When this happened, basically what happens here is that we find out that Carter Slade was actually a force for good, while his great-great-grandson, Lincoln, was just an evil, really evil son of a bitch. And within Hamilton's body, Carter and Lincoln had actually fought for control. But the difference is, Carter never wanted to possess Hamilton, but he needed to stop Lincoln from doing so. So what happens is that Damien Hellstrom, one of the supernatural heroes that was trying to exorcise Hamilton, has enough power to banish one of the evil spirits within Hamilton's body. And unfortunately, Carter had to be banished as well. But what happened is that Hamilton Slade gathered enough willpower to actually completely assimilate Carter's ghostly soul into that of his own body. And thus, Hamilton Slade literally became his own great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, the original Phantom Rider. So after this, Mockingbird decides that she pretty much wants to have nothing else to do with the West Coast Avengers. So she completely left, and she became like sort of a part-time member of the regular Avengers, but only in a certain amount of capacity. The relationship between Bobby and Clint would pretty much go through a whole lot of turbulence throughout all the years of the Avengers comics. They would slowly start to like each other a lot more in several different events. However, the one event, it was a West Coast Avengers event that actually brought Clint and Bobby back together, was when the West Coast team had encountered Ultron again. But this time, he created a robotic mate for himself named Alchema, whose brain patterns were actually based on that of Mockingbird's. But Alchema betrayed Ultron and helped the Avengers. And Clint, who at this time actually assumed the identity of Goliath, finally managed to settle his differences with Mockingbird, and they decided to pretty much make up. Unfortunately, their newfound recovered friendship wouldn't really last long, because Mockingbird would actually be captured by the demon named Satanish, and Satanish would actually team up with Mephisto. And when this happens, the West Coast Avengers try to rescue her from Mephisto's realm, but unfortunately she's murdered and she ends up in hell. So, unfortunately, the West Coast Avengers comics did kind of end on a very depressing note, but it actually turns out that the Mockingbird that we saw throughout the entirety of the West Coast Avengers comics wasn't actually her, but it was in fact a Skrull imposter. And in recent comics, Barbara Morse has actually come back as the real Barbara Morse, and then we actually figure out that between the time that she and Clint met for the first time and the time when she had actually joined, and between the time when she was killed, somewhere she was abducted by the Skrulls and replaced by a Skrull imposter. So we can safely say that the Mockingbird in the current comics is, in fact, the real deal. But that's really all I wish to talk about concerning Mockingbird. Overall thoughts on the character? I was actually kind of surprised researching this character, because I kind of figured that there would be more times in the comics where she and Clint would actually be a lot more intimate. But surprisingly enough, they haven't really had that many romantic scenes. Just quite a lot of distrust. But at the same time, you do get the feeling that she and that Mockingbird and Hawkeye do genuinely care and love each other. However, their romance isn't quite as played up as that of, say, Black Canary and Green Arrow or something like that. But overall, I like Mockingbird a whole lot. I think that she's quite an underrated character. She's a lot more complex than most people actually give her credit for. And her relationship with Hawkeye is very unique. In my opinion, it's one of the more unique superhero relationships ever in comics. And hopefully, maybe one day in the live-action series, we may actually end up seeing her in one of the